While we wait for Brook, welcome everyone. I hope you enjoyed your break. So the session that we're going into now is going to discuss current technology sharing initiatives or efforts to benefit the Global South. And the emphasis is on the mRNA program, and we'll look at pros and cons of these initiatives, including any issues, outstanding intellectual property barriers, Global South active inclusion, transparency, and decision-making, and the role of Geneva-based initiatives in addressing global IP barriers in pandemics and other emergencies. Joining us online is our first speaker, Brook Baker.
Hello, I'm here. Do you hear me? Yes. Hi, everyone, and that I can't be in Rio, but I had to follow at least some of your previous presentations and really have learned a lot, and so. Many of the activists who are at to talk about a new initiative that it has recently come about, and the promise it holds for a new form of South-South coordination. Now, I was told that the people there might be able to share the presentation. If that's not true, then I'll try it up myself. Are the advisors going to put the presentation up, or shall I?
Just give them a minute, Brook. They're working on it.
Okay, fine. So, I'll begin, introducing what I'm talking about, and maybe slides will be there soon to catch up. Okay, so maybe we can go to the next slide. So, people may have heard that last year, the WHO and other partners decided that the vaccine apartheid that had been experienced with respect to the messenger RNA vaccines, which had such a positive effect in preventing disease and more importantly, serious disease, was unsustainable, and that there was a need to come up with a production capacity in the Global South, and hopefully one that would be shared among many countries. And so, drawing on a previous precedent, which had been developed in responding to the influenza pandemics of the past, WHO proposed and others cooperated massively to establish the Messenger Technology Transfer Program. That's its new name. It used to be called Technology Transfer Hub, but now it's called the program. And its initial goal was to try to quickly develop the messenger RNA technology platform and a COVID-19 vaccine that was basically a clone of the Moderna vaccine. As most of you know, Moderna, because of its own commercial interests and monopoly power, declined to share its technology platform with the hub. And so the hub was forced to recreate that messenger RNA vaccine technology platform itself. But the idea was that given massive contribution from scientists and people who knew about manufacturing around the world, that the hub would develop its own technology know-how, and that it would share that technology as it was being developed with other partner companies in other regions of the world. And so what was called the hub, which is located in South Africa, worked initially on making just a very small quantity of the messenger RNA COVID-19 vaccine, the Moderna clone, succeeded in doing so. Now is in the process and has developed clinical trial product, which will be quickly deployed to begin clinical trials. And then is simultaneously within its manufacturing entity, Afrigen, will try to develop manufacturing capacity at a commercial scale and the know-how associated with that, which will then be shared with the other partners around the world. The key, that's one key aspect of this program, which is sharing that technology. But a second aspect of what the program is trying to do is that there is an agreement between all the partners that they will continue to try to innovate to develop messenger RNA vaccines and therapeutics for other pressing health needs in low and middle income countries. They're not going to stop with COVID, though they are also simultaneously trying to find an improved formulation for the messenger RNA COVID vaccine that would be more heat stable and not require the ultra cold chain that the current products require. So there's a desire to both simultaneously increase the research and development capacity and for any improvement by any of the 15 partners to be shared equally back among all the partners. So instead of companies coming up with pursuing exclusive rights, it's really a share and share alike type program where all of the entities will be engaged in mutually supportive and hopefully open science innovation, and at the same time be willing to share the fruits of their research back with each other. Next slide, please. So these are a map and then the list of the partners at this time. It's not necessarily closed. There may be others open. But one of the things that the map shows in particular is how geographically dispersed this network actually is. And of course, is its strength. Manufacturing of COVID vaccines was concentrated in the global north with some production capacity, of course, in China and India in particular, that many countries of the global south were last in line, not just months in line, but over a year in line before they received some of the vaccines that were so desperately needed by their populations. There's a list provided on this slide of how the project is being funded, and the president has received, commitments anyway, over $100 million. Relatively inexpensive when you think about it, though I think much more money will be needed actually for all the partner organizations to develop their capacity, and so that's something that I think we'll talk a little bit more about during this presentation. Next slide, please. So again, this is what what its ambition was. I've covered this briefly before, but I'll do it so in a little bit more detail. So the initial ambition, and particularly when they thought they might get Moderna technology transfer, was to be able to develop first in South Africa, but then with partners using the commercial technology transfer know-how that Moderna had. And extensive negotiations ensued, and simultaneously there were negotiations with Pfizer. And neither of those big pharma companies were willing to share their technology platform. And they're basically, with excuses you heard about in previous presentations, oh, the companies can't really do it, oh, it's too hard to do technology transfer. Ultimately, they are honest and say, this is a technology platform that we intend to build on in the future, and we plan to have multiple future monopoly protections for other messenger RNA vaccines and therapeutics, particularly in big profit centers like cancer, et cetera. And therefore, we want to keep this technology to ourselves. And that was really the true explanation about why the technology transfer didn't happen. So as I described previously, the hub and its internal partners in South Africa are going through a really rigorous and unexpectedly quick development of the messenger RNA technology. Again, already producing clinical trial doses that can hopefully be receiving approval. and then clinical trials will be conducted even as ongoing research is conducted. And the facility in Cape Town will continue to develop the commercial capacity that will be required in order to receive regulatory approval. The hope is that in 3 stages of basically technology packages will be already transferred or soon to be transferred to all the partner organizations, all the partner entities. And they'll get different technology packages as the technology is developed. But simultaneously, there'll be efforts to actually train some of the workforce in the partner entities in other regions of the world. A lot of that training is going to be done through a facility in South Korea, but also some of those partners are also coming to the South African facility to undergo training. And then, of course, as I described previously, one of the most exciting aspects of this is the hope that the 15 partner companies will continue to conduct research and development, continue to make improvements in both process manufacturing and also in applying the messenger RNA to new health needs. Next slide, please. So I wanted to focus, because I think it's so important, especially in light of some of the earlier discussion today, on the impact of the TRIPS regime and intellectual properties on access to medicines, to say that intellectual property barriers stand in the way of this program's success, and they do so in multiple ways. So basically, in order for this program and the partner organizations to succeed, they're going to have freedom to operate, both in terms of conducting ongoing research for new applications of messenger RNA, disease applications, and for improved processes, but also for the ability to commercialize the resulting vaccines that they make and to sell them both domestically and in other markets. There's one particular patent application by Moderna, which is extremely broad and unfortunately has been granted in South Africa, that really, would threaten the development of new applications to new diseases of the messenger RNA technology platform. There's been a patent landscape developed, which is available, but unfortunately, the landscape continues to become more complex, and many more patents are expected to be applied for. We know that both Moderna and Pfizer are already exploring messenger RNA applications to a dozen new diseases, and they will be filing and probably already have filed what are now still undisclosed patent applications for some of those new uses of messenger RNA technology. I mentioned that there might be barriers to research and development of new products even before commercialization. We know that the hub in South Africa believes it is free to work at this point under South Africa's early working exception that would allow development of material to be submitted for regulatory approval of a vaccine product. And the presumption is that they believe that that this covers basic research and product development for new applications, as well as just the meeting the regulatory process itself. We would have to think as well about, well, what are the research rights and early working rights in the other partner countries? Do they have research exceptions? Do they have early working exceptions that will allow them to undertake the research and development processes themselves? And that would require a search of national law and also a close examination of the expanding patent landscape from the originator companies. And as well, we would have to wonder in those countries whether there are patents available for new uses. We know that's not necessarily possible, for example, in some countries. But if there are new uses of an existing product, of existing products, then that could also be another kind of barrier to access. We have heard, and Moderna has touted that it has a non-enforcement pledge with respect to its patents on its only on its COVID-19, its current COVID-19 vaccine. It has said it will not enforce it even into the future against low income and lower middle income countries, and has said that it will give an exception that would allow production by the South African hub as well. But there are concerns that this pledge by Moderna is revocable, and in any event, it only covers the basic patents on the COVID-19 vaccine, and does not include permission to use the underlying technology platform itself, particularly for new applications. One of the things we learned with the COVID pandemic that activists had not focused on as much in the past as we need to do now, is that trade secrets and confidential information and commercial know-how are critically important with respect to being able to produce commercial quantities of vaccines, and indeed for biologics, the more complex, larger molecules that are increasingly important, monoclonal antibodies among them. And so we need to have mechanisms for overcoming those barriers as well as patent barriers. Then lastly, the barrier that we really need to think about that would impact the program's success is that it's not going to be good enough for these companies to merely produce for their own domestic markets. The reason to have regional capacity or capacity in underserved regions is so that those manufacturers can also provide lower cost vaccines of assured quality to other countries that don't have domestic manufacturing capacity, where the originator is charging far too much and where otherwise people would go without. And so you not only have to have freedom to operate by overcoming patent barriers in the countries of research and production / commercialization, you also have to have freedom to operate, meaning to import and to use in the import markets, the countries, other countries of the region. So that's a much more comprehensive task of overcoming patent barriers in many countries. And again, will require close observation of the patent landscape as with respect to particular products, messenger RNA products going forward. So all this really is about the critical importance of countries actually taking on board their obligation to assist the companies in overcoming intellectual property barriers. So maybe we can go to the next slide. So again, this is just a representation of the readings of the regions that we're concerned about, and basically just to graphically represent that each one of these countries will have its own national laws about patent protections, research exceptions, early working exceptions, data exclusivity that will need to be assessed. Each of them, if need be, would be, depending on the patent landscape, might need to issue a compulsory license that would support importation of products produced by the messenger RNA program partners. So there's a lot of countries that have been underserved by the global north that would need to work in concert to create viable export and import markets. Next slide, please. So the companies can't create the freedom to operate by themselves, full stop. It is the countries in which they are located that have to take steps. And this was mentioned previously in the earlier session this morning about the need for concerted action. And concerted action, concerted defiance, however you want to call it, but concerted action by global South countries to overcome the patent barriers that would otherwise stand in the way of freedom to operate and a viable export-import markets. In many instances, that will call for national law reform for easy to use presumptive or mandatory compulsory licenses. And I just wanted to mention a little bit that we don't have to play in the middle of the field with respect to compulsory licenses. We can really push the edges on compulsory licenses. We can have very easy to use procedures, and we can have them be presumptive. That is, if an application is filed, that it will presumptively be granted. Or we could even go so far as to say that they're mandatory compulsory licenses to meet certain kinds of health needs, including certainly pandemic needs. But as emphasized before, you need that kind of law reform in each country, and you simultaneously afterwards need coordination, in my opinion, on the use of, and applications for compulsory licenses between all the partner organizations, partner entities in the messenger RNA program. All 15 manufacturers would need to issue compulsory licenses if there are patent blocks in their country. And then, of course, there would be an even larger number of countries that would have to cooperate to issue compulsory licenses to allow importation from the countries of production to aggregate efficient, large enough markets that would have efficient economies of scale. There are many other tasks which governments would need to use, which we probably won't go into in huge detail in this session, but clearly there needs to be regulatory reform to expedite domestic marketing and approval of these messenger RNA products from program partners. And then also for the sustainability and viability of the manufacturers, there need to be coordinated, durable procurement, advanced purchase, and stockpile agreements, and to recognize that there are very different kind of requirements for different diseases. Some you want to stop in your tracks by having some stockpiles in advance. Others you might need to scale up because just the scale of a pandemic happens very quickly, or they're already, large outbreak, large diseases already, like malaria or tuberculosis or HIV. There is this underlying question about the reality that some of these vaccines will be more expensive, at least in early stages, when procured from program partners than they would be from the big pharma perhaps for the big pharma companies, though that might be in doubt. But they might be relatively expensive. They might be more expensive than, for example, the large-scale manufacturers in India. And so will countries be willing to pay more and to cooperate and coordinate with other regional partners to create that sustainable market, even if the products are a little more expensive? Next slide, please. So an important question to think about is messenger RNA is an important technology, but it's not the only important technology. And the question of whether is this new model of what was previously called hub and spokes, but is more respectfully called program, but whether this technology sharing and innovation sharing model can be applied to other vaccines, medicines, and diagnostics, and for, basically not just messenger RNA. And of course, to the extent that this is a good idea, then this could be a fundamental form of South-South cooperation going forward, where basically you get out from under the yoke of a big company, a multinational company control, and rich countries' efforts to control the global market. Next slide, please. So there's still a question in my mind about what is the fundamental purpose of this experiment and whether it could be made even bolder. So one version of this program would be that it's just a form of distributed, commercially oriented industrial policy, industrial capacity development policy. In other words, it's basically companies saying, well, we want to be able to produce something locally. We want to enable our local producer. We want our local producer to be commercially successful, which oftentimes means, selling at super competitive prices, at high profit margins. And that's part of our nationalistic internal industrial development policy. And of course, we all, have wanted there to be expanded domestic manufacturing capacity, but to the extent that it's commercially motivated and controlled, as we heard in a previous session, a local monopolist is no better, not much better than an international monopolist in terms of the well-being of people, who need to procure that product. Is the program designed and the program partnership designed mainly to meet the domestic supply needs, the domestic security of the producing countries? There are multiple producing countries on the map of the partners, but they are certainly not all the countries in the world. And if they're just for producing for themselves or primarily or preferentially supplied domestically, that's frankly not good enough, because that means other smaller and poorer countries without domestic manufacturing capacity will be left behind in the regional markets. Is instead, and this is the hopeful vision, can we be thinking of this as an entirely new ecosystem for innovation and for access, where the priority is not commercial success of entities and their survival and basically using only commercial returns as the way to ensure sustainability and viability over the long term. But is the public sector, our governments, really going to commit resources needed to make these entities viable to meet public health needs? Are these going to be truly platforms for open science research? Are they going to be a guaranteed source for equitable access across a broad variety of products that are needed? And where the public sector and governments get to set priorities on research, and where they get to set priorities on equitable access, affordability, et cetera. There's a little bit of reason to be concerned about this. The licenses that are currently drafted by the Medicine Patent Pool to the partner organizations from the hub do not have what we might call performance requirements. They don't have requirements at this point in time with respect to affordability, nor equitable distribution within the relevant regions. Again, I think part of our role as civil society activists would be to try to push this project towards this public health, right to health perspective, and not so much just reinforce a new, global South commercialization. Global South commercialization that guarantees increased access would be better than what we have right now, which is being at the end of the line. But the question is, would it be good enough? And I think that's my last slide. And so I look forward to hearing from the other panelists and then responding to any questions. So thank you very much.
So I'll just give a minute for English speakers to please place the translation device. I'll be speaking in Spanish. Muchas gracias. Pues bueno, es un placer para nosotras presentar al director del área de investigación y desarrollo de biomanguinos Fiocruz, que como bien decía Fátima, pues hay una razón del por qué estamos todos aquí en Brasil, y es para mostrar nuestra solidaridad, nuestro apoyo a lo que es uno de los representantes de los centros de producción de vacunas en América Latina y además pues uno de los grandes productores de vacunas y tecnologías sanitarias en la región. Entonces, sin nada más, pues le doy la palabra a Sotiris.
Muchas gracias. Thank you for the invitation. It's great to be here, and I'm bringing a somewhat different perspective or complementary perspective to what Brook presented as a Brazilian public health institution and at the same time a member of the HUB program. So let me see if I can get that to work. So we belong to the Fiocruz. So we belong to the Fiocruz Foundation, which is a public health foundation. It belongs to the Ministry of Health, and it's working for 120 years promoting public health. So Biomanguinhos is one of the institutes of Fiocruz responsible for the production of vaccines, biologics, and diagnostics. And we're about 2,500 people working with that purpose. So just very briefly, I have a list of our products currently. We have 12 different vaccines in the market. One of them is the COVID-19 vaccine, which was a tech transfer from the AstraZeneca. And we usually produce about 100 million doses of vaccines for the national immunization system every year. And to that, we added about 150 million doses of COVID-19 vaccine. This was a tech transfer, which was completed in a record time. And at the same time, we have our own internal development of the RNA vaccine. So these are just some numbers, and I think that's important because, as we saw last week in South Africa, and it became obvious that not all the partners have the same production capabilities or the economies of scale. So there was their BioE, and they presented that they produce 3 billion doses of vaccines. Then there's Biomanguinhos, which had 700 million doses, and there are other companies that do not yet produce any vaccines. And that makes a very big difference into incorporating into the hub and contributing to that program. So we, within the institution, we do from applied research, always focused on new development, all the way to proof of concept, preclinical, clinical studies. We take products to the market, we produce them, and then we accompany them for all the duration of the life of the product. And we were created to give response to a public health emergency in '76. So it's not very different from what's happening now. We had an epidemic of meningitis, and Biomanguinhos was created to produce a meningitis vaccine 47 years ago. And since then, we've acted in all public health emergencies, specifically trying to give solutions, whether that be of diagnostics or whether that be of vaccines or therapeutics. One of the key points that I would like to make is that with adequate resources, low middle income countries and public foundations, public institutions can offer technological solutions. We saw that during the pandemic. We incorporated by tech transfer vaccine in 8 months, and we produced nearly all the doses of the 200 and something million doses that we've produced during the pandemic of the COVID vaccine locally here in Brazil. We've developed diagnostics. We developed them in 40 days. We had a capacity of 40,000 kits in the beginning per month, and in 2 months we scaled up in 2 million. So, and since then we've produced some 30 million tests. So what usually happens is that we get, in low middle income countries, we get a very big boost of funding during crisis, and then that dries up. We have no continuation like high-income countries or big pharma has. And that has an impact on us bringing products to the market. Usually, we try to give solutions emergency-ized during a moment of crisis, but then we have difficulty to maintain that to the future. So another point that I think it's somewhat different from Brook's view on what he brought was the model of the hub. So we were announced in September, 21st of September 2021, but we were announced as a regional hub for the Latin America and the Caribbean. So the model at that moment was that there were going to be regional hubs. There was a regional hub in Africa, which was Afrigen with Biovac. Regional hubs in Latin America, which was Biomanguinhos and Synergium. And there would be selected also regional hubs in Asia. Due to financial, political, and other pressures, companies wanting to enter the program, it became probably difficult to maintain that model. So the decision was taken by WHO that there would be only one hub and everybody else would be spokes. So we were announced as a hub, as a regional hub, before that change in the model, but that became later not the case. And, well, one of the problems with that, before I go to sustainability, was that when we entered the program, we had our own technology. Pfizer and Moderna refused, with everybody else, to do a tech transfer. That forced us to push on our own development. To a certain extent, that had been good for us, because if they had tech transferred, we would never have a product of our own, and we would always be licensing from them. The fact that they refused forced us to push on our own development, not abandon it, as we have done many other times. And we had a product that we're submitting patents on it, not to explore the patents, because we are a non-for-profit institution, but to guarantee our freedom to operate. So we have our own technology, and that permits us to pass it to the hub and to use it for our own production. In terms of sustainability, obviously financial support is key, and I mentioned that earlier. And that was clear when we look at the various companies. Nobody started during the pandemic. They didn't produce a vaccine in a year. Let's be clear about that. Oxford was doing it since 2008. The viral vector vaccines, BioNTech since 2008, Moderna 2010, and even Biomanguinhos in our case. The fact that we had a NAT test for HIV, hepatitis B and C, let us develop a molecular biology test in 40 days. Otherwise, we would never have. And the fact that we had the platform to produce biologics in eukaryotic cell platforms allowed us to do a tech transfer in 6 months, 8 months. Otherwise, we would need years to put together a new plant and produce. So, and the case with RNA, we were working on RNA, we were working for cancer, but we had expertise, and that helped us to move quickly. So we discussed in South Africa last week about the sustainability model. A COVID vaccine is not going to make a plant viable for a long term. We don't know for how long we will need COVID vaccines. The indication at the moment in Brazil is that it will be an annual vaccination. So in terms of economy of scale, Brazil is a big market. If we count what influenza market is on the annual vaccinations, about 80 to 100 million doses. So that is a significant number. But maybe tomorrow is not anymore. So we put together a plant where we can use some of the equipment for the production of other biologics, like somatropin on the fermenter where we produce the plasmid. We can produce the plasmid during some weeks, and then we can have another production of other biologics to make that plant viable. We've gone for an automated process in our production, and the idea is to work together with Afrigen to validate the automated versus a traditional production process. That may also be of interest. Well, this is our facility where we plan to do that, on the third floor of that building, which is where we'll produce the RNA COVID vaccine. And obviously, we cannot be a spoke on that program, not for any other reason, but we have our own technology, so we cannot receive a tech transfer. And we have a mutually exclusive agreement with AstraZeneca about COVID vaccines. So we received the technology for them, they couldn't transfer to anybody else, and we could not receive a COVID vaccine from anybody else. It's a mutually exclusive agreement, which would not let us sign a tech transfer agreement with a hub. What we're looking at, and what was our intention from the beginning, was that we transfer to anybody else who may wish our technology. We can, I mean, we also, as a public institution, cannot sell in the private market anyway. We sell for the Brazilian public health market and through humanitarian institutions like UNICEF, Gavi, the PAHO Rotary Fund, for example, for Latin America. So we export to Africa, but we export through these institutions. Is not a private sale. And the other thing about that is different from what Brook brought to the discussion, is that as a public health institution, we have a sustainability model, but not a profit model. So when we produce something, for example, an RNA vaccine costs about $1.20 to produce, more or less, is what we estimate. Pfizer sells for $20. If we produce for $1.20, then we sell at $1.40 or $1.50. So the difference in the price and the economy that produces for the Ministry of Health, for the public market, is enormous when you talk about $100 million of vaccines. I just put a couple of slides of our technology. I know that this is not a technical meeting, but I couldn't. I'm a scientist, I had to. So there are two different models of RNA vaccines. There is the traditional mRNA model, and there is a self-amplifying model. Both Moderna and Pfizer have strong patents on the traditional one, which their RNA goes into the cell and transcribes an antigen that is then produces the immune response. The self-amplifying model permits that this RNA is replicated a few times, is copied a few times within the cell. That requires smaller doses, which makes the vaccine even more economic. And the patents, the majority of the patents they filed does not cover that, so that also gives us a bigger freedom to operate. And this is the construct. That's to show that it works. We've done the experiment in small animals. We can put the RNA where we need to, into the cell, and we can protect the animals. So all the animals vaccinated with the RNA stayed healthy, whereas the others suffer from the infection from COVID. And our model is to take that to the market by 2025. We need to do clinical trials because it's a new vaccine. In any case, as Afrigen didn't receive a Moderna technology, they will need to do clinical trials anyway. If Moderna had registered the vaccine there and had tech transferred, they wouldn't need clinical trials. But not having done that, they will need to do clinical trials as well. So we can possibly collaborate on that front. The other point is that having freedom to operate, it may help us give the technology in some of the countries where more of the Moderna patents are enforced. So unless the government breaks the patent, really, as Brook discussed, then it will be very difficult for them to use the technology that Afrigen is developing at the moment. So perhaps this may be an alternative within the hub network to share technology that is not heavily patented, heavily protected. And I brought that slide, that figure from a report published in The Economist, where I had contributed actually. And I wanted to say that for smaller producers that don't have the financial support that the big farmers have, collaboration is imperative. Not only on the research and development, but also in the production, the manufacturing. We need to have procurement and pricing. Brazil is somewhat different. As we're a public institution, we have a support automatically from the government. The Ministry of Health buys from us vaccines, but we were in the 15 members of the hub network. In the beginning, we were the only ones. Now there's a Twala Institute of Serbia, but again, the economy of scale for them is totally different from Brazil. And everybody else is a private company, so that makes a difference. We need distribution and logistics, and we need supply chain. This is a problem we have in the majority of low middle income countries, is that we don't produce the material that we need for the production of vaccine. So we may not import the vaccine, but we import the prime matter for the production. And that sometimes during pandemic, during crisis, is something that is missing, that bigger companies have access. We saw that during the pandemic, a lot of the material we needed for the production was not available, and we needed intervention from government and from other interlocutors to manage and get the supply of the material we needed for the production. So unless we solve that problem also, we remain somewhat prisoners of the global north, I guess. And I think that'll be it from me. Thank you very much. So I'm happy to take any questions.
Thank you so much. Our next speaker needs no introduction. Fatima Hassan will be our next speaker. I think many of you know her. She's an activist human rights lawyer, and she's dedicated her life to the cause, particularly public health and health rights. I was surprised to learn that she won the Calgary Prize last year, FYI. So please give a round of applause for Fatima.
Thanks, Baone, for embarrassing me. So I'm not doing a PowerPoint, and really honored to be on this panel with Brook Baker and Sotiris, who I met for the first time last week in my hometown in Cape Town with 400 other people, and only 5 or 6 civil society people in that entire room of partners to the mRNA Hub program. And I'll come to the reflections about that Cape Town meeting shortly, but some of my remarks and reflections are based on a paper that Brook and I are working on around this program, and particularly the risks for the South African program, for a number of risks that Brook has already detailed, but some other issues as well, which will be published hopefully in the next few weeks, and then also some of the reflections based on the very, I think, schizophrenic and very strange answers we got or sought to get from the Cape Town meeting. And Dyer mentioned something yesterday about 10 or 11 years ago, where a group of us tried to warn about the dangers and the imperfections of a system that relies on pharmaceutical benevolence and volunteerism of CEOs, which unfortunately all came to bear in the COVID pandemic. And when we did warn about that, we were seen as the difficult activists. And I remember that our warnings about the Matson patent pool and the way it was set up was seen as dividing the movement. And so I really hope, with so much humility and a lot of concern and worry, that in the next 10 years, somebody doesn't say, but Fatima and Brook warned us about this 10 years ago in Rio. So I hope you take my concerns with you know, a lot of seriousness, and we don't say this to be difficult activists, but we do have a lot of concerns and worries. And the first thing I should say, Sotiris, as a South African, is, and this is going to be the controversial thing, is I think they chose the wrong hub. I think that the hub should have been based in Brazil, and I'll explain to you why later. But that was the decision of the WHO and the Medicines Patent Pool. We don't know, we think we know who made the decision, but there's very little transparency, and somebody mentioned that in the presentation yesterday about how does the WHO make decisions for not just member states, but for countries in the middle of a pandemic, and so too a self-elected private foundation, Medicine Patent Pool, that is based in Geneva. And with all due respect to people who work at the Medicine Patent Pool, some of them are my friends, so this is more about the institutions and less about personalities. So some people are calling the mRNA Hub program the silver lining, the radical plan for vaccine equity, but I want to argue that all of that is at risk, and I'll explain to you why. But at the same time, I think all of us recognize that the hub, or I think they've renamed it, because people felt that the language of hub and spokes was very colonial and very derogatory, and many of us agree with that. So let's just call it the program. But let's not forget that for 18 months, that's what they called it. Okay, so I'm not going to jump into the revisionism so soon. I think we must, in brackets, say formally call the Hub and Spokes program, because that is what was agreed to in Geneva. So it's supposed to be one of the most important and innovative approaches to reducing dependency on the global north countries that have fueled gross vaccine inequality and vaccine apartheid because of the pandemic. But the hub is located in South Africa, where Afrigen, again, some brilliant, great scientists, are not state-owned. They are privately owned, and they have commercial investors that need to make sure that there's a commercial outcome for them, or else the entire program for South Africa is also in peril. And BioVac, one of the first project partners, is also not 100% majority state-owned. It only has about 43% state ownership. So it's a very different situation playing out in South Africa compared to Fiocruz in Brazil. But the hub has to succeed. So we are in this difficult situation, because we can offer our critiques and offer our concerns and ask for revisions and transparency, but the hub has to succeed, because we have to show the global north that global south reliance is possible, and for the next pandemic, we're not going to rely on the global north. And I'll come to who the funders are of this program, and many of you will be either surprised or shocked to learn who they are. But we've got to take advantage of open science research. We've got to take advantage of the fantastic science that is currently happening. But last week we did say at the meeting that all of the spectacular science is at risk because of two companies, Moderna and Pfizer. Today I'm going to focus more on Moderna, but everything I say about Moderna applies equally to Pfizer. And I mean, I think it's no surprise, given the multiple interviews that Stefan Bancel has given to the Financial Times in particular about his views about global south countries, about the hub, is that Moderna filed patents in South Africa. That was the first, in my country, in South Africa, that was the first thing they did. They have not submitted their clinical dossier to our regulator. We cannot use Moderna vaccines in our country. They refused to sell to most of Africa until the New York Times did a deep expose, and then they did a small donation to COVAX for African countries. But what they did was file patents, all right? Because they knew, based on the announcements that were coming out from the WHO and MPP, that South Africa was going to be the host. And they filed very broad patents, patents that have been rejected in other countries, patents that have been withdrawn in other countries, because we have a very permissive enabling TRIPS plus apartheid era IP system that our government is refusing 25 years into democracy to change. So we'll come to what the Global South government's responsibilities are, because it's not just pharmaceutical companies. So the important thing about the hub in terms of generating this fantastic science, sharing the science, is also that they've begun this like fantastic training that has already commenced. I know that the Brazilian team have come at least thrice now to South Africa, and the South African team have come on multiple occasions to Brazil, and then last week was bringing together, I think, at least 14 of the 15 partners to the program to South Africa for this really fantastic Global South collaboration of science, but still determined and dictated by the MPP and WHO. And I'll just give you one quick anecdote about that is you have a meeting in South Africa in Cape Town with our racial discrimination pass, and the meeting is started by 4 white men in a row from the global north. And this is not funny or a joke. It's I think, the mindset of how this entire program is unfolding and how decisions are being taken. And I think we really have to be wary of that. It's supposed to be a Global South program for the Global South Initiative. What's called the steering committee is headed by a French national who comes from the MPP, who comes from UNITAID. We have said to the DG of the WHO for the last 18 months, you're talking about Global South reliance, you're talking about how this is something that is going to be a response to what the Global North did to us in the pandemic, but there is not a single person in the entire Global South that you trust to chair the steering committee. You have the Gates Foundation representative on the regulatory pathway working group. Is there no other experts in the Global South that can be on that regulatory pathway working group? Why is a funder sitting on a technical working group? So, these are some of the questions that make people say that we are being the difficult activists. So, the governance framework, to put it mildly, is very unclear. Is a concern, and because we have been asking questions, not because it's a voluntary decision to share information, etc., except for the licenses, which have been shared, the terms of the license agreements to what's called the spokes. That has been voluntarily placed on the mRNA Hub program website by the MPP. But we, as civil society, in the multiple calls with the MPP, have been asking questions of who are the members of the steering committee? Who makes up the working group? Can we see the terms and conditions of the funding agreements from the donors? And so some information is now being made available. I think we've had, Moga, at least 3 civil society calls with the MPP so that there is some form of consultation. But if you look at the structure of what, I'm just calling it the steering committee, in the last few weeks they've renamed it as well. There is no minister from South Africa. I don't know, to be honest, if the steering committee is only for South Africa or if the steering committee is for all 15 countries. You need to go ask your spoke partners if you come from Senegal, if you come from Tunisia, if you come from Ukraine, Brazil, Argentina. Are there equivalent steering committees for those particular hub programs, right? So we're just focusing on the South African one. I don't think there is. But we have a DDG from our Department of Science and Innovation, and then, I don't know, is making decisions for Brazil, Argentina, or nobody really know how all of this works. And then there's at least 3 working groups that we know about, and then the funders. So I'm hoping you will not fall off your chairs, and you will hopefully get rightfully angry or concerned, because the funders to the program, and yes, it's great science and all of that, but we just went through this pandemic. We went through 2.5 years of governments in the global north telling us we don't need a TRIPS waiver and putting a counter proposal on the TRIPS waiver. And so we need to ask the difficult questions about the funders and who makes decisions and what are the terms and conditions in relation to IP, because I'll tell you what happened last week as well. But the funding is coming from what's called Team Europe. There is no Team Europe website. They are not a group, it's a hashtag. So hashtag Team Europe, Belgium, Politico, Johnson & Johnson, Canada, TRIPS waiver, European Commission, France, Macron, who brought the vaccines on his plane only for French nationals and opposed the TRIPS waiver, sorry. Germany, Norway, and then apparently the South African government and the Medical Research Council. So all the TRIPS blockers are the funders to the HUB program. Now, in my view, so I don't get sued for defamation, in my view, personal view, they are not funding this because they feel bad. They are not funding this because they feel guilty about their direct contribution to vaccine apartheid. Do you know what Macron did in South Africa when we were entering? I don't know if you know this, Sotiris, but I'll just tell you this because you will understand why we are so enraged by not having sight of the funding agreements. Macron came to South Africa as part of a trip that he was doing in Africa to apologize for the French colonialism barbarity, right? This was during the COVID pandemic. And then he came to South Africa to have a meeting with our president to announce the Aspen J&J deal. We were waiting for vaccines. My family, my colleagues, my godmother, people who were older, we were entering a devastating wave of infections. He brought 2,000 J&J vaccines on the presidential jet. And when they landed, they took the 2,000 vaccines to only vaccinate French nationals in South Africa. And then after that, we found out and we worked with all of you. Yeah, I mean, but everybody's forgotten amnesia, right? But the worst thing is that we then found out, because we'd been working and a lot of you helped us, that the vaccine, they told us that Africa can't produce vaccines, no quality, everything's, shit in Africa. But J&J was given a license to Aspen, and so then J&J, didn't get any bad press because, oh, look, they gave a license to somebody in Africa. They gave it to Aspen. We're all waiting for our vaccines. Literally, we're waiting. It's not coming. And then we're like, but there's an export permit. Somebody put an export permit on Twitter. And we followed the export permit, and the vaccines were being shipped to Europe. So our vaccines, filled and finished here, were going to Europe to vaccinate people there, and then Macron was bringing probably 2,000 of that batch back there to give the French nationals. So it's a very perverse way. And so that is, I'm telling you all those stories because when we ask questions as activists of, do not trust these governments, we'd like to see the terms and conditions. We'd like to see, and this is the nub of it, right, Moga, that is there a condition in the agreement which says that as the HUB program, you cannot break the patent of Moderna and Pfizer? Because there must be. Because these governments have said this before, they've opposed the TRIPS waiver, they are not interested in breaking the IP. And many of us have been saying this for a while, but last week, when we asked directly this question about whether the MPP, because they've now started putting a disclaimer that they only advise governments, if the program fails, it's your fault, right? You must go take on pharma. But they set up these programs here. So we asked them, have you advised the South African government to take a compulsory license against Moderna and Pfizer? And they refused to answer that, or couldn't answer that. And so Brook's point about a coordinated set of compulsory licenses for countries is really critical. But these are the irony is that Team Europe did put a compulsory license counter proposal, and they said it's easy to use, it should be used, you don't need the waiver. So I think we have to call that bluff. I think the demand from civil society to all these global South governments is say, do exactly what Team Europe told you to do. Issue the compulsory licenses, and then let's see what happens, right? So obviously they'll drag us to court. So that's just the issue of the funders, but that agreement you won't find on the website. The terms and conditions of Team Europe. Team Europe was there last week in Cape Town. We asked them, since you are putting so much money into this program, by the way, it's not a lot of money compared to arms for Ukraine or, for other priorities. It's like a couple of $100 million. It's nothing for them. But you're putting so much money into this hub, and we're telling you that there's a peril, the freedom to operate is at risk, that there's a danger. Have you approached Pfizer and Moderna to ask them to explicitly cooperate with the program with no strings attached? Universal access, no geographical limitations, which is the normal way the MPP does it. with no restrictions, and they didn't answer that. The answer we got from Marie, sorry, I pronounce her name wrongly or whatever, the chair of this committee, who comes from, the MPP background, was we're not breaking patents. We have no intention to break patents. We are going to respect the patents because the funders were sitting in the room. That's my view. But what she did say was, we've had conversations with Moderna, and these are exact words, it became heated, and then we stopped. But maybe we'll go back and try and have more conversations with them. So we are, again, at the mercy of Moderna. We are right now at the mercy of Moderna, maybe not in Brazil, but I definitely think so in South Africa, because of the context in which I've explained. And our government, we have requested an IP strategy. We have warned, you are placing this program at risk. The entire global science idea and the innovation, you're going to have all the science again, and we're not going to benefit. Or, alternative scenario is, watch. They will sue Afrigen and Biovac when the time comes for them, where they actually have a product. And the irony of it is South Africa does all this, work and partnership and training, and then we'll have to get vaccines from Brazil. Or something like that is going to happen. Because the CEO of Moderna has said to the Financial Times, while we have no issue with the hub doing the work on the COVID vaccine, and they've, indicated this now in writing, Brook and I have established in their legal suit against Pfizer. Pfizer's now countersuing Moderna. There's 7 cases in the US involving Moderna, Pfizer, the NIH. So it's a huge legal mess around whose IP this is, right? And we have always said it's the people's vaccine, right, Val? We have always said that this Moderna vaccine is not theirs. But the problem is that in the absence of any kind of assurance and legal protection, even though I think the partners to this hub don't want to say this publicly because the funders are sitting there, and then maybe you don't get funding, and so unfortunately they are not calling the warning bell. And we have to, in Rio, call the warning bell. That this program is at the mercy of 2 sets of actors now, Moderna and Pfizer in the pharmaceutical industry, because the program wants to develop vaccines, not just on COVID, on TB, which affects us more, on HIV, which we need, on malaria, on other diseases, on diseases you're working on, Brazil. This is not just about COVID anymore, right? So the product development is now, the research is not at risk. And apparently they have some workarounds, and maybe we can get around the patents, we're not sure. But if you rely on that technology of Moderna for the other diseases, he has said to the Financial Times, when that point comes, we will assert our right and seek to enforce our IP, because that is our IP, that is our technology, even for cancer. And remember, this is the same CEO who likened the South Africa hub program, where I live, to a fake Louis Vuitton handbag, right? Also in a Financial Times interview. So let me just wrap up with, do I have a few minutes to wrap up, or very quickly? I just want to mention the role of universities here, because you, Sotiris, you presented this, but I'm not sure the extent to which public universities in Brazil are involved. But in South Africa, and this is the reason we were told South Africa was selected above Brazil, right? Was that there are 3 public universities in South Africa that were already doing this work and research, and they were quite advanced, particularly on using mRNA platforms for TB. The University of Cape Town, the University of Witwatersrand, which is Johannesburg, and the University of Stellenbosch. There are 3 publicly funded and public universities involved in the partners of this hub program in South Africa, which creates an added complication in the ecosystem of, if you do develop a product for TB, HIV, malaria, whose IP is this? And we asked this, Joe, right, in the solidarity visit with the hub last year, whose IP, when all of this is done, will it be? And the answer we think we got is it's the MPP's IP. And they will negotiate licenses with different partners. We know rich countries are already looking to benefit from this and pay a premium, and they will determine the royalties. They will have the discussions with Moderna. They will determine a lot of things, but these are our publicly funded universities. And I think if you are tweeting, the question we would like to ask the MPP today is, while there's a hub program and everything is supposed to be centralized and you're signing all these different agreements, is it true, because this is what we have been told, we're not sure, is it true that you have signed a bilateral IP agreement with the University of Cape Town? And if so, does the hub program know about it, and why? Why is this in parallel, and can that agreement be placed on the website immediately? Because if a TB vaccine is developed, that has to belong to all of us, not the MPP and not the University of Cape Town, because then we'll have a Oxford University AstraZeneca situation. I feel like I'm really done with time, so I am going to stop, even though I have many more points to make. Thank you.
Thank you, Fatima. And we'll take only a few questions because we're a little bit over time. And then please stay for the surprise story that we're going to have after questions. Por favor, solo tomaremos un par de preguntas.
Hi, thank you for these presentations. I have a little comment and a question for Sotiris. My comment is, I don't want to do the theory of conspiracy, but again, we spoke about fake solutions during the last couple of days in terms in health and also in climate, but these hubs, I'm wondering whether it is also, again, a kind of fake solution, because first, if it is the problem of developing countries, and I'm speaking maybe from my continent perspective, Africa, why do we need Team Europe, WHO, and MPP to help us to discuss local production? What kind of transfer of technology? Why mRNA hubs? As far as I know, the only mRNA vaccines that work is COVID. Africa imports almost all its vaccine, and none of them are mRNA. I don't know if you have seen Andrew Hill's paper recently, a few months ago, where he compared the efficacy of mRNA and non-mRNA vaccines, and actually all of them worked, and we focused on Pfizer and Moderna, and maybe we missed an opportunity to vaccinate the world if we have used other vaccines. So yes, this is the comment about who is driving the agenda, why these technology platforms, why these countries, why these companies, and I think Fatima raised the question. My question for you is, okay, we all support local productions, and we see that for market reasons, for whatever, we are not going to be as competitive as the Chinese or the Indians. And what is the experience of Brazil in terms of, I guess you are a bit more expensive, I know, for ARVs or others than the cheapest generics available. How do you conciliate in Brazil public health policies and industrial policies to accept to what extent local prices that are higher because the situation, the market, etc., is not comparable? I know in my country there is a kind of discussion on national preference now in public tenders, and to accept to some extent a threshold of difference. But some people are saying, no, this is not possible with TRIPS agreement, we should have national treatment, etc. So I'm just, how to conciliate the facts, and I think recently in South Africa, you ended up buying Indian vaccines instead of those produced locally. And thank you.
Gracias. Bueno, gracias a todos los panelistas. Tengo muchas preguntas, pero quisiera aprovechar que está Fiocruz Y tengo dos preguntas para Fiocruz. Una es, ¿qué se necesitaría para que podamos producir los materiales que se necesitan para hacer estas vacunas y que actualmente nos dice que no lo tenemos en la región? Y la segunda es, ¿por qué razón Fiocruz no ha ofrecido alguna tecnología a CITAP de la OMS? Ya la Universidad de Chile ha ofrecido una tecnología, pero entiendo que Fiocruz no. ¿Por qué sería eso?
Luis, can you repeat the last question?
Okay. So the question is why Fiocruz hasn't offered a technology to the COVID technology access pool. I mean, there is already Chilean University has, a license about to be signed. I was wondering, why not Fiocruz? I mean, some little pill at least.
To respond to the first question, no, sorry about that.
I'm saying in our countries, national producers cannot compete with the cheapest one in India. And
so that's true worldwide. There is a preference for nationally produced vaccines. In terms of perhaps with big Indian producers, we can compete, but with the big pharmas, we are cheaper anyway. So, but as we're a public institution, there is a preference for locally produced vaccines. So we don't. With regards to the technology, from the beginning, we intended to share the technology with anybody that wants it. And we are working with PAHO and with WHO for that. But I guess as it's a new vaccine, they're waiting to see if that will reach the market. I mean, the difference between doing a Moderna-like vaccine and doing an original development is that you need to prove that it's just as efficient. But in terms of sharing, we are free to share.
So we have a queue, Luis. So I think next is...
Hi, this is Tahir. I think if we look over the last 20 years, so this is a part statement question, we've really moved into this, from the beginning of the sort of 2000s where TRIPS came about in many countries and people were talking about flexibilities. And then around 2010, we went into this mode of managing IP, which is what this is. So we live in this world now where we manage IP. And I was just curious, based on what Professor Stiglitz was saying and what some of us have also said, is what scope do you see in this hub thing for disobedience? Or is there a possibility for people to say, actually, this hub is not going to work because it's just another neo-colonial project, which is funded by European states, that actually, what we talked about yesterday about South-South cooperation, that the southern countries need to get together and create their own version or project and actually say, this is the way we're going to do things, and that this is where you can only build decentralized production, because otherwise we're forever going to be managing IP, and it doesn't work. It's a voluntary system, and it's not going to work, because unfortunately, the UN institutions like the MPP, the Gavis, the what have you, they will not touch IP. They won't. I did a project on vaccine production in developing country manufacturers, and actually Gavi squashed a report on how to actually deal with some of the IP issues. This was 2012. This is Seth Berkley. They won't do it. They just want to actually perpetuate the system. So why doesn't the global South countries that have capacity, that have technology, like Farmaginosh, why don't they get with the Cubans and everywhere else and start working together instead of relying on this imperial system?
I'll just make the last one. I'll speak in Portuguese. Graziele Custódio da Vida Oxfam, América Latina. Vocês estão falando dos hubs de produção de vacina RNA mensageiro. Existem outras iniciativas também acontecendo. O governo brasileiro, pelo representante Carlos Gadelha do Ministério da Saúde, tem dito que quer chegar a 70% de produção da demanda nacional e fazer uma cooperação regional. A OPAS tem falado, não só falado, mas iniciou uma plataforma regional de política industrial, de produção de tecnologias em saúde, não só vacinas. Então, eu queria saber como que essas iniciativas dialogam entre si e, né, como sendo da região, eu queria saber como que essa ação do hub e a plataforma pode melhorar a cooperação regional para a maior soberania nacional em saúde dos nossos países.
Bom, primeiro, uma parte da... Sorry, going back to English. One of the initial questions was why the RNA. There's no particular reason, I guess. We, in Fiocruz, produce with probably all different technologies from egg-based to inactivated virus, attenuated virus, or bacterial vaccines, it doesn't matter. The yRNA was because it offers a technology that is quick to change from one vaccine to another, and the footprint of an industrial plant is much smaller. The cost of putting together a plant is much smaller. So you can have a production of millions of vaccines within a space of that room instead of needing big industrial facilities with 2,000-liter bioreactors. That makes a difference for smaller producers that don't have the technology, so they can put something together quickly and at a smaller cost than with some of the other platforms. That's one of the reasons that I guess RNA was chosen at this moment for that initiative. Through the DCVMN, the Developing Countries Manufacturing Network, we are collaborating for a number of other technologies and a number of other vaccines. Like the colleague said here from Brazil, there is that initiative for Brazil to have more than 70% of vaccines locally produced. So there are public institutions that cover the majority of the production. There's Fiocruz and Butantan, and we both have different platforms. And Hub is just a part of that. It's not an only solution or the solution. We work on all the other projects to coordinate, but it offers a new technology. Theoretically, if there is no IP project and the lipid and the plasmid is the same, you can change only a small part of the RNA code to produce different antigens in a very small time, so you can change from one vaccine to another without needing toxicology studies, without needing to prove that it's safe, because what the organism sees from outside, which is the lipid nanoparticle, doesn't change. So it has some advantages, technical advantages, but that doesn't mean that it will substitute the other vaccines or the other technologies. It's to complement and give countries that don't have a big industrial capacity some solution that in a small space and smaller investment can produce a few million doses of vaccines that will cover local production when that's necessary. Patent landscape, again, if we manage to get out of the Moderna Pfizer, and one of the broader patents is the one that Moderna is fighting Pfizer. Now, if Pfizer wins, and the Moderna patent on using modified nucleotides, for example, doesn't hold, then that will open up for everybody else, perhaps, So it may be that we need the government to take action and stop the patent. That's a broadly acceptable patent, and it's absurd because it was developed by University of Pennsylvania and the hard participation of NIH and so many others. But in any case, even the big pharmas are fighting over it because they're both using it. So if that patent drops, then we have a much bigger chance of using the traditional mRNA technology anywhere, and the hub will benefit from that for sure.
So just a quick response, and then Brook, because I think our moderators are telling us to wrap up for the surprise presentation. Just a note that this isn't the only kid on the block, right? There's many other initiatives. It's just that this is being coordinated through some kind of system. And there's other mRNA and non-mRNA initiatives around open source and open science in other parts of the world, but we couldn't have everybody on the panel. So to Tahir's question, I think you can think of disobedience in one of two ways. And I think you can think of it in terms of a legal IP way, and this is why Brook and I are arguing for a coordinated set of compulsory licenses for all the Global South hub countries in this program that have an IP barrier. So you go in with multiple compulsory license at the same time instead of only South Africa doing it or only another country, because that gives you more political protection, especially from the US trade pressures and the US pharma industry and the European Union. But to be honest, our governments are not going to do it. I can tell you now the South African government is not going to pursue a compulsory license for multiple reasons, and we can sit here the whole day. So we're going to have to do it, and maybe that's what we, after Rio, as civil society, have to figure out, a coordinated campaign of civil society requests for compulsory license in at least 5 or 6 countries where there is a severe patent barrier. But I think there's another way, Tahir, of being disobedient and being the difficult activist in the room. Because enough of this, we're doing this for you. And, just listen to us and just trust us. No, let's change the governance of this program. I mean, a coup could involve, a coup as in a governance coup, could be like, can the MPP please just sit as an observer now? Step out of the room and stop signing all the deals and agreements. You're not the only specialists around us. Let's get the 15 countries to really take control over governance and decision-making and reconfigure the working groups, reconfigure the steering committee, reconfigure the decision-makers of this entire program. But there's so much vested interest that are currently based in Geneva that nobody's going to be open to that. So the question mark from Rio is how do we begin a program of questioning and a program of disobedience, aside from just protest action around what is happening, not just in terms of IP, but also transparency and governance. So maybe there's also a page on the Rio 2023 website, if any of you are interested, on the mRNA technology program, all information from public sources, but also the 3 PowerPoint sets of slides that the MPP used in the 3 civil society meetings. So we are just making it public because we believe that every civil society group should be able to see those slides. So have a look there. Thanks. Brook?
Yeah, I too want to respond at least briefly to Tahir's provocative question about, what does defiance or disobedience entail, and who is and who is defiant? And who is it that we pressurize? So, I mean, I think anyone we can lever that whole, we should be pulling to the maximum extent. But, we are faced with the problem that the governments do not act on behalf of their people, and they don't act cooperatively in terms of Global South. And there are many things the governments could do. We sought a global waiver, but in countries had the right to act under Article 73 to institutionalize national waivers of intellectual property rights. None of them have issued effectively a compulsory license on a patented vaccine or antiviral. Few of them have amended their laws in any way to really make use of compulsory licenses easier. So we have to be defiant to make our country governments defiant. And, Fatima, of course, expresses, pessimism about South African government. And we can, because there's been a fix the patent laws campaign in South Africa since 2011. And the same government that proposed the waiver internationally has not passed the domestic law. We're sitting on the desk of the Ministry of Trade, Finance, and Competition for the last 2 years. And won't even present it to Parliament and the Cabinet for to become real. So I think we need to try to push the governments to be defiant and use the power they have. It would be even better if we could get them to override our IP system, but at the very least, we can press them in response to this current and future epidemics to take the steps necessary to protect themselves and their global South partners.
Thank you, Brook. Well, we'll need to wrap up because we have been taking 10 minutes. If Lorena, go ahead quickly. We don't have a mic.
Thank you for all the presentations. I was thinking that we can also use oppositions. We have already developed some arguments, and we know that we analyzed the Pfizer and Moderna applications, and we know that there are no new, there is no inventive step. So we have arguments and proofs that these are not, well, I understand not all the countries have the same laws. So maybe some civil society won't be able to use the opposition because it's not in the law, but some of us already have. So my reflection is not to think only about compulsory licenses. We should also go for oppositions, pre-grant oppositions. Thank you.
Well, thank everybody, and especially we're going to take Fiocruz for allowing us to go visit them tomorrow. And thank you, as we said in the we said in the presentation, we are very happy to support what's going on in Fiocruz and the solidarity that it deserves. So a round of a big applause, please, for
Yeah, just to add on to Sofia's thanks, and thank you so much for our panel and our panelists. Thank you to Brook for joining us online. And if you want to have any further discussions, I think we can do those over lunch. So lunch will start from 1:15 and we'll take it to 2:15. And then our break at 3:30 will only be 15 minutes, and we'll have our surprise presentation when we come back for the plenary at 4. So those are just the adjustments, but I think we'll all be following each other and we'll figure it out. Thank you so much for your time and enjoy lunch. Sorry, before you go to lunch, since we're all in the room, please can we take the photo?